I've always seen museums as mothballed, cobweb-ridden spaces, and never really felt the urge to go inside a museum unless one is taking a group of students. But you suddenly kind of humanized a museum space, especially in some of the visual material that you shared with us, how palaces had become museums for the upkeep. Suddenly the people who were inheritors of this huge legacy of artifacts and sculptures and palanquins and wonderful jewelry, the sadness of their lives entered into the entire space, which seemed like a dead space, suddenly was made alive. And especially that wonderful contrast that you brought about the Maharaja of Mysore, where you showed him holding on to a ritual, a ceremony, like a vestigial survival, while there was a larger new government that was completely erasing a whole history of a life. How, it's such a fresh way of looking at museums. Tell me that what brought you to this point?
But the thing is, Neelam, that when I was looking for what I should study as a student, I was divided in my mind about whether I want to do art history or I want to do anthropology. My heart actually belongs to both.
Right.
And in some ways, I think when I look at art, I look at its social presence.
Yeah.
And so for me also, in looking at museums, I look at it more like an anthropologist looking at a particular kind of institution in society.
Yeah.
And this makes me look at things in a particular way, which has a different trajectory from what you would normally expect, which also has the capacity to disappoint people. Because when people hear that I'm an art historian living in India, working on museums, and particularly those of us in India who know what has happened to our museums, expect me to have a developmentalist approach where I should understand what is wrong with museums and how to set them right. And of course there is a lot that is wrong and there is a lot that needs to be set right, and I could possibly be doing something more useful for the world by trying to identify those things or look from that perspective. But actually my pleasure comes from looking anthropologically at these institutions. So my desire is not to look at the museum in India and say, oh, it's a failure. For one thing, our idea of failure will come because we have already some ready-made idea or benchmark of success.
Yeah.
So the museum should be this. And it's almost always imitative of some kind of Western model. It was imitative in the colonial period, when the museum came as part of a colonial agenda of governance, and so it had to perform certain roles. And in today's world, where you have well-traveled people who are seeing how chic museums are abroad, we again feel that we are lacking in museums because they are not like the museums of the West. Today what I spoke about was one fragment of my interest in museums in India, but I'm working on 3 or 4 different essays or 5 different essays which will get pulled together into a book which look at the museum in post-colonial India. And I'm really, the premise from which I start is that let me not start by saying these are all the things our museums are not, because then I'm measuring them by a yardstick from somewhere else. I'm saying as far as possible, let me cleanse my mind of all of that and let me come in and see what the museum is.
I think that's such a wonderful and positive approach. We are so busy kind of taking what you would call via negative approach. So it's very refreshing that there is a kind of looking at it, and I think that's your yearning as an anthropologist, which is asserting itself into the way you're looking at it. Now that absolutely stunning thought and what you pulled out from your own perceptions of how you viewed it was the Nazarana. You know, how a ceremony which is rooted in a certain tradition, in a certain sense of the king as the benevolent Mai Baap, where everybody comes and pays their little homage to him, and how it has been dovetailed in the whole industry of tourism. I thought, I mean, you know, all over the world, you know, you go to Versailles, or you go to, even if you go to the Domos in Italy, large homes are impossible to maintain. Even if there was not a erasure of the kingly, princely class, and there was no privy purse that was taken away from them. Even then, to maintain those huge, magnificent buildings with a changing lifestyle, economic pattern, etc., 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 were unsustainable economically. So you find this happening even in the Domos,
in many places, yes,
in Versailles, and many more examples like that. But what you did, which I haven't seen in other parts of the world, you showed us through humor, through irony, through contrast, through great humanity and compassion, a way of looking at a passing time. Not with nostalgia, not with narcissism, not being narcissistic, but in a manner where you understood the whole process of change in a new emerging India.
I'm very grateful for you for saying that, because sometimes one of the anxieties I have about my own approach to things is that I'm afraid that I might seem cynical, you know, too cynical, because I like to use humor.
I thought it was affirmative.
I'm very grateful that you, I'm very grateful that you said that, because I feel, to me, it's not possible to pin down exactly where I stand on X position, because to me there are too many complexities, you know, because there is so much of, when you start getting into the details of any place, its history, any institution, what it's gone through, to me there are too many, on the one hand this, and on the other hand that, you know, and there seem to be so many different truths about the same phenomenon, that I find it really important and valuable to try and explore as many different subject positions in relation to it, you know. So how does the Maharaja feel, but how does the local MLA feel, but how does the local visitor feel, but how does the foreign tourist feel, and each one of them is, you know, you have to give them some kind of space, yes, and you have to go in good faith, that they're also coming in good faith.
But, you know, I like that quality of not taking a definitive position, because sometimes a definitive position can become the lens through which you miss out on something which is intangible, something which is mysterious, something which comes from a sense of faith of the people in relationship to those spaces, those figures. So I think what really worked for me in your talk, in your presentation, was the fact that I was not being led. I was allowed the right to misinterpret and create my own narrative. And that was what was so refreshing. Tell me, Kavita, the state of our museums are really not in such a good shape.
No.
I'm starting from a negative premise. Is there a consciousness amongst the so-called people in power who are taking decisions, policy makers? Is there consciousness of some desire to change it or to?
It's a very mysterious business, Neelam. We have to understand that 90% of what is important by way of our art heritage belongs in government hands. We have to understand that the conditions of government service are such that there is absolutely no incentive to do anything when you are in a job. In fact, there are strong disincentives against doing anything. So, for example, if you are a curator working in a museum, you will not get anything extra for making an effort, putting up a show, taking initiatives.
What passion?
But if you do something, you will get envy, the envy will lead to complaints, which will lead to accusations of wrongdoing, which will lead to CBI inquiries against you, which we are actually physically seeing in institutions, right? So there's curator I know in Delhi who did something in the National Museum, who helped some exhibition to come together. Maybe some people were jealous, so for nothing else, now there's an inquiry against him about how much they paid for the packing crates, right? So there is something very rotten in our culture, which does not in any way encourage or reward you to do something good in the culture of our kind of government service, and instead punishes you for doing anything at all, because any step you take can be a misstep. Now we are frozen in this kind of stasis where there is this cadre of people who also are occupying positions, who came into positions at a time when there was very little money, no glamour, certainly no power in these jobs. So I think that the very good people actually withered away, got frustrated, gave up in these jobs. And you often have museums staffed by people who have no hope, no aspirations, no desires or expectations. And then when someone fresh comes into their scenario and tries to do something, that will be the person to pull down and immediately attack. So that's one range of things. A second range of things, and I don't know if I should even say it, but one of the things that I find absolutely appalling, and if I were not a government servant, I would myself be going to court and doing public interest litigations about it, is the conditions of physical housekeeping of the objects. Forget about how bad the galleries are, but you cannot begin to imagine what the storage is like. And the criminality of the way in which things are kept. At one level you can hope that this generation of curators is not good. In 30 years maybe our museums will be good. But if they don't have any objects physically left because of poor storage, criminal neglect, that will be one amazing thing. But the other thing that I think is criminal is the fact that these museums, which are supposed to be holding objects for the public good, so these are actually publicly held objects that are over there, they do not even document them.
Yeah.
Right? So if you ask, does your museum have these 20 bronzes which somebody once saw, there will be no record of it. And the lack of a record, I believe in many cases, is actually purposive, because the idea is to not be accountable. Because then pilferage can happen, or even if damage happens, if ants get in or rust sets in and an object isn't there, if there's no proof that the object was there in the first place, then how can you prove that it's not there?
But don't they have committees and stuff like that, which is made up of museologists and archaeologists or whoever?
There is no accountability from what I can tell in these institutions. There doesn't seem to be any carrot and any stick. And I don't know how these things are run. I don't know what kind of micro politics happens in terms of patronage and allowing people to remain recumbent for so long. But obviously there's something very rotten.
I know that, at least in Chandigarh, the little I know of how this museum functions, a lot of time they are going to different parts of the world on sarkari trips, to go and look at museums and bring that input and that knowledge into improving their own museum. I mean, I was in Taipei a couple of months ago, and the Taipei Museum, which Madam Chankya Sheikh had taken all the
yes, of course,
stuff
the
of
most
China and
important,
brought it there. I mean, it's kind of a little overwhelming in terms of the way it's preserved and everything behind glass cases, and you go too near and bell goes off and you're led in. I mean, it's really something quite extraordinary. I haven't even seen that kind of museum in some of, Guggenheim, or some of the other museums. It's extraordinary the way museum culture or going to the museum, which, as you very rightly said in your talk and very beautifully said, it also gives you a sense of your identity, which in this day of globalization and shifting sand of values and your own sense of self in relationship to nationhood or whatever, in a certain way a museum reaffirms a connection, as you said, the past made alive for the present. I'm not quoting you correctly, but to some extent I think that is what you meant. I mean, why is that? What is the psychology? Why don't they see the significance of it? I mean, I understand. I mean, why don't they do it? You know, I mean, I know it's like healthcare and, you know, medical and electricity and, I mean, hundreds of other things come into the pool of the lacunas of what ails us. But you've done a lot of curatorial work for museums, which means you've had lots of connections in curating shows. Have they been in government museums or in private?
No. So to answer the first question first, unless our systems of working change, which include actually some kind of punishment for not being productive or effective or active, as well as a reward for being active, things will not change. And this actually reminds me even of what my friends who are business people say about the difference, let's say, about trying to do business in India and trying to do business in China. Where when you go to China and you want to set up a factory, it seems to be very quick because at every level there is a system of accountability and rewards for bringing in business, for increasing productivity in an area. So the what we would consider the equivalent of a district magistrate, you know, he is also supposed to be assessed on what development he has brought into his district, right? Now, unless we have that model, which we don't think of actually as a Sarkari model, we think of that as a private sector model. But unless we bring that kind of model into our government service or alter the terms of service so that you have contract employees, which also the government resists because you cannot have contract employees in charge of very precious and expensive objects, no? So unless those changes happen, I don't see a big change happening in that 90% of objects sitting in the government museums.
I mean, it's quite amazing what people have done on an individual level.
Yes, so there you will have some kind of action. In fact, in the study that I'm doing about museums in post-colonial India, I think I have only one chapter which is looking at only at government museums, you know, because the phenomena which are interesting, even if not perfect,
but these
are in different forms of the private
but the difference
domain.
is the private, correct me if I'm wrong, the private museums are really dealing with what you call contemporary, modern
Yes,
work.
so there's contemporary
but
and
they're not dealing
modern.
with Chola bronzes.
But the Maharaja museums are private museums. Another phenomenon that I'm
right.
actually interested in is what temples and religious sects are doing.
Tell me about this.
Well, there are a number of very interesting things that are going on. For example, even in Puttaparthi, Sai Baba has this funky museum. So just as the state is interested in husbanding a heritage which is a national heritage, which actually sets us apart from others, you will have something like Sai Baba's thing, which is ecumenical, which is trying to talk about global unity, you know, because it's got a vision of universal man. So there will be these things. It's quite kitschy, it's in very poor taste, it's a funny sort of place, but it's got objects from all over which talk about a common ground for all humanity to come together. And the way in which they demonstrate it is by bringing some examples, could be plaster casts or fiberglass copies, not original objects, but of artifacts from all over the world, where art becomes this universal and universalizing language.
Is it considered a museum?
Oh yeah, it's a museum
not a
place with
meditation
vitrine.
hall.
No, it's a museum place with vitrines. And in fact, if you look at what Sai Baba has, then if you look at the Hare Rama, Hare Krishna people, and here again, what happens is that when I look at different domains and I'm looking at museum-like formations, all of them shade off into something that is not only a museum. So if I'm looking at Palace Museum, then I'm seeing it merging with heritage hotels. In these places, if one is looking at these religious museums, they merge into theme parks.
What took you there?
What do you mean? What took me there, ma'am?
What made you enter into that space? Is it because you're a follower of Sai Baba?
No, no, not at all. And I'm not looking only at Sai Baba.
Was it a sense of research?
It was precisely as I was telling you, to not have that constrained idea of what a museum is and what a museum should be, so only look at the art places, but to see, I am looking at museums which deal with art, but I'm looking at museums that take art and make different messages out of it. So in a palace museum, you might have somebody taking an artifact and making something about his dynastic history, you know, foregrounding his dynastic history through the object. In the case of someone like the Sai Baba, art starts to be something that stands in for universal human values, which the Baba is then, you know, centrally concerned with. You have all kinds of then also quite different messages by other sects which are Hindutva, which also use the museum form and the theme park form in a way that constructs boundaries instead of dividing them.
Why do you call it a park?
Oh, because they tend to spill over into environments where you enter an ashram-like space which is dotted with forms of exhibition. And so one of the most elaborate and lavish actually for me is Akshardham, which is done by the Swaminarayan sect. And it is quite extraordinary how sophisticated their understanding of the use of exhibitions in all kinds of forms as a communicative medium is. So when they made the Akshardham in Delhi, the first Akshardham that they made, which had this kind of a set of displays, was in Gandhinagar and is less sophisticated than the amazing place in Delhi. When I went into the Akshardham in Delhi, my first reaction was one of profound embarrassment, because I had just gone to the National Museum and seen how shabby it was, and then you come into this privately run space which is immaculate, impeccable, and it's got all of these kinds of displays from low tech to high tech which are running perfectly. Okay, so the first thing is that the whole of the Akshardham thing, which is put up by the Swaminarayan sect, which is a very wealthy Hindu sect of Gujarati origin. It's a Vaishnav sect, but is inspired by a particular late 18th, early 19th century figure called Swaminarayan. And they have a tremendous presence in the diaspora. So it's a fantastically wealthy sect.
That's interesting.
Fantastic presence in the diaspora. Now, their culturation project actually starts with a very complex project of temple building, where in the diaspora Hindus have made temples, but they have often made temples, or in the earlier years they have often made do with whatever they got. So they got a community hall, they got a shed, they got a warehouse,
just bought churches.
or they bought churches and they just made it temples. These Swaminarayan people started the business of erecting in all kinds of locations a pakka, beautiful, shastric, stone carved temple. And the way in which they have done it is something absolutely amazing, where they have identified these traditional architects, sculptors from Gujarat. They have got them to move to a port in Gujarat, which is one of those free port areas where these export licenses don't apply. They are making the stone pieces there like a giant jigsaw puzzle and putting them on ships so that they can leave, you know, and be numbered and reassembled at all kinds of locations. So you have a perfect, what looks like a perfect medieval Hindu temple in Nigeria, you have it in Australia, you know, you have it in North America, in all kinds of, in London.
This museum in Delhi replicates copies of that?
No, now what you have in the museum in Delhi is a central monument which looks like a medieval temple. You know, you could be looking at the Surya Mandir in Modhera, except that it's about 20 times larger. It's made with carved stone, intricately carved stone. When you enter inside, it's like being in Mount Abu. So the outside is sandstone, the inside is almost filigree of marble. It's kind of exquisiteness which is almost unbearable. You know, it's so fine. But this thing is put inside a circumambulatory path which is modeled on Angkor Wat.
How amazing.
Which acts at least subliminally as a reminder of the spread of Hinduism beyond the shores.
And do you think this was
nahi ji,
interpretation, or they
nahi
were
ji,
aware of?
these people have Harvard graduates and MIT graduates who have given up their normal lives and converted and become sadhus, and who are masterminding these things. They are smart people, totally smart people. So there's this Angkor Wat parikrama, which reminds you of the global spread, you know, an ancient Hindu empire. And then just outside this parikrama, there are all kinds of other structures, but there is a set of exhibitory spaces that you have to go through. The first one is a robotics show, where you enter these environments. Neelam, as a theatre person, you will find this interesting to see how they've manipulated space, because they have created all these kinds of installations in which you walk through the life of Swaminarayan, where you walk into a street. It's like a stage set or a film set. It's full scale. You're walking on a street which is like the kind of street where he was born, and there in front of you is a fully life-size diorama where there is a big banyan tree under which there are 4 or 5 children which are life-size mannequins, one of which the spotlights come on and he begins to speak and move because he's a robot. And it's the kind of robotics that is used to make Star Trek and things like that. They've used Hollywood technicians to make these things. So you walk through these set of environments again where there is a very interesting set of bodily relationships, because you are walking on one ground, but the exhibit is sometimes all around you, sometimes it's below you, sometimes it's above you. They have a very interesting way of using space where you walk through this person's life and you enter a series of dioramas which have these moving and speaking robots which enact key scenes from his life. Then you enter a full like IMAX size theatre in which they have a giant screen movie which is about the life of this person, the founder, Swaminarayan, when he was a young ascetic who was wandering through India. And it is lush, you know, from these panoramic views of the Himalayas to the rushing water of the ocean at Puri. It actually is a pan-Indian journey. It becomes he becomes a national figure.
So it's like tableaus and...
The film is on location. The film is on location.
The film is there.
The robotic show is tableaus, but fantastically done. Then you have this huge film, and then you enter a boat ride. So you get into a tunnel, and this swan-shaped boat comes and takes you down a water channel. It's in East Delhi. You have to go there.
Where in East Delhi?
As soon as you cross the Nizamuddin bridge, it's on your left.
God.
It's an amazing place. It's utterly amazing. So
Thank
when
you
you
so
see
much for telling
things
me.
like this, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you go to Japan,
Huh.
you go to this big museum, I can't remember the name, where they recreate the whole of Japanese society before industrialization. From the weaving to the way people lived and their kitchens and what the kitchen implements are. And you know, they're so wonderful with creating food, images on plates. I mean, it's like a whole journey. You feel you've got the whole history of Japan, this king and that dynasty, and you know, it's amazing what is happening in different parts of the world. So history becomes like animated, and it's great for children, you know, to excite their minds, their imagination, to see. Instead of seeing them in books, you're actually seeing them shake your hand, or you know, what their lifestyle was. So that, because the visual language can create a much more deeper understanding than perhaps the written word at a certain age. I don't know, is it lack of imagination, lack of will, failure of will? It's very depressing. It's really very depressing, because whichever corner you turn, you meet the same miasmic pit. You see it at universities, you see it on the level of education, you see it, I mean, those pictures that Shiba showed about juxtaposing the miniature, the pastoral, and the river, which was such a point of romance and such a...
Those were so powerful.
Filled with garbage.
You
feel, what have we done? You know, we seem to have destroyed everything that was precious, which was beautiful. And I really am not speaking like a revivalist, because you don't see that anywhere in the world. There's a real failure of national character. And what you're telling me is amazing. Now, moving on, Kavita, you've been doing some work with in Patiala.
Well, that was an episode, that was a job I had at one point, very soon after my PhD. I got a job at Intact,
Yeah.
and our aim was to try and do something in Patiala. I have to say I was involved only for a year or so and then I left, but it's heartening to see that some things have been done. There is that festival, and I presume some parts of the Killa have been repaired and restored. But it's an unfortunate thing to look at something so beautiful and to see a whole combination of factors that can lead to the profound damage of a very beautiful building. So some of it is pure greed, where people try to encroach on the walls, and I think the first initiatives actually occurred because shops that had been abutting the wall of the Killa started digging into the wall in order to increase their size. And that actually led to the collapse of the wall, which in a way had a good effect because then it attracted attention and it set in motion a whole chain of events. But I remember being with a number of conservators who were trying to assess the condition of the building. And in addition to all the bad things that stupidity or greed or just plain neglect can do, I think part of the problem of that building was also that some of the techniques of construction inherently were not very good. No? And so there were some elements, because it's something that has been organically growing over many generations, and there are bits that are tacked on to bits that are already existing without necessarily distributing the loads properly. So I'm afraid that there were some places that the architects used to say cannot be saved. Then the issue arises, what is your ethical position with regard to conservation? And so far in India, we have had what is considered a relatively conservative position with regard to conserving monuments, which is that you stabilize whatever is about to break and you do the minimal amount of repairing to something, but you don't try to reconstruct something entirely so that an old thing suddenly looks new. No? And so I think there was very much that mold which was operative in the way in which the Killa was being approached the time that I was involved in the project. What lies in the future, I don't know. But I have been a bit appalled to see in a number of monuments that I've been seeing, particularly in Delhi, it may be elsewhere as well, somewhere we seem to have flipped the switch and changed to a very aggressive kind of treatment of endangered buildings, which amounts to actually having no compunctions about the degree of intervention, to the point where you might be quite happy to just rip out old things that seem unstable and just make new ones and think that you have made things, that are as good or as valuable or as historic. Of course, there are differences of opinion even in the aesthetics, but there is something also to be said about the ethics, and I think there is also something to be said about the kind of mindset that we have developed now, where it has something to do with our obsession with lifestyle, glossy surfaces, something that is easily consumed.
I think that's why the point you made was very moving for me, when you talked about how in certain places in Rajasthan, because of economics not having entered into the fray of what you call prosperity, because of that, one doesn't wish that on any social situation, that the preservation or
it's
this
just
ugly
willy-nilly
urbanization which you see. I mean, I come from Amritsar and I'm appalled when I go there, where all the old Havelis
have all
or the
gone.
old kothis with their courtyards and their wrought iron, whatever, lovely places have been made into these mini malls or Costa Coffee, and it is so distressing. So in a funny kind of, I don't want to sound like one elite wanting my cultural tourism to remain as it is, like slum tourism, which is such a disturbing phenomena, but I think it was also in Brazil and other countries, and that's where it picked up. So I think even with conservation, sometimes, as you very rightly said, such an aggressive kind of approach, with tiles are being, you know, this lapis lazuli tiles and the
Humayun's tomb, yeah,
You
that's
know,
a prime
it sounded
example.
so distressing. It was so much better to have ubar khabar tiles, but to at least preserve that whole smell, smell of history and smell
Right,
of
right,
belonging.
right. And there's a certain romance that we also attach to the ruin, which we don't seem to be able to appreciate anymore.
Purana Killa.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't want to do a kind of cement pageant-based job over it. But
But you know, I think that this is now the culture or the model of heritage hotels, where the heritage hotel has to actually completely preserve itself and offer you something that is seamless, you know, seamlessly old and seamlessly new at the same time, because the hot
bathrooms
water
are
has to function, the bathroom has to,
air
exactly.
conditioning has
And
to
so I think this heritagization of consumption has actually now worked backwards, where everything that is heritage has to be a consumable at the same time.
like the Neemrana Hotel,
Ha.
like that big Maharaja train,
Ha.
so you recreate the experience through your pocket, that you can also live. Because you've
Bilkul,
arrived, you know, it's a very arrivist kind of
Bilkul.
position to be in.
bilkul.
There is a, I understand the economics of it, and one understands that it's part of the whole tourist kind of gizmo, which is all over the world, the cobbled paths and the palaces and the old grottos. And so it is something which perhaps I will have a very ambivalent relationship with. You're also a teacher. You mustn't forget your role as being part of the GNU. You're part of academia. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, you teach miniature?
I teach some courses on miniature painting and some courses on art institutions and museums. So I teach in these different areas. I also teach courses on the history of art. So we look at how the study develops. I teach these different
And
areas.
what kind of quality of students are coming?
It's very variable. We take not a terribly large number, but close to 30 students every year. And out of them, 5 or 6 are wonderful every year. And a number of them are not so wonderful, and a few are not wonderful at all. But it is very, very exciting to get into touch with a lot of young people who have a great desire to do something. And my anxiety for them is where they go with their hopes and dreams and wishes and ambitions after they leave that very safe bubble that we provide for them. One trend that I've noticed with a lot of students is that a number of them come in with a very strong interest in something to do with pre-modern art. So somebody wants to work in miniatures, somebody wants to work on ancient sculpture, you know, they want to work on all kinds of themes. And one by one, they all abandon that idea when they are faced with the realities of the world we are living in, and they all slide into modern or contemporary art. And the reason for that, Neelam, is not just that there is a market and so the market generates different kinds of work, but I believe the reason for that is that the kind of laws that we have in place, which have so restricted our right to own objects that are more than 100 years old because of the Antiquities and Art Treasures Act and so on and so forth, they have made such a suffocating environment for things that are old, that in the private domain you will not find the coming up of private collections or private museums as you have in modern and contemporary art. There's this energy which is coming not just in the market but in this associated public domain sector. You are not going to have a collector developing, like a young person today beginning to be interested in buying ancient or medieval art today, wo to hoga hi nahi. And even people who already have collections or have inherited collections are not going to declare them to the public because they just don't want the hassle of dealing with that intense government oversight.
But you know, this, I'm a little confused about this because there is the whole ethical question that what is part of a common heritage, you know, which is part of the universal pool of objects that lead you into your own identity, history. They belong to a space which is accessible to to people.
Yes.
But if I want to put it as a display in my drawing room, then I'm cutting off a kind of link, which may be, now again I'm romanticizing, museums with its collection of a certain Basoli art or Bundelkhandi art, you know, would
allow the people,
allow the people to go there and see and create their research material. So do you feel that things which belong to common inheritance of a community, of a nation, of a region, should not be in a space which is accessible to?
No, I have a kind of ambivalent attitude towards this, and I see this as a complex kind of field, because what we accept as our heritage is very constructed, you know. And so as suppose we do this little thought experiment with the students, so it's okay, let's look not at physical objects as your heritage, but let's look at practices which are your heritage. So the songs that your mothers and grandmothers would sing at a wedding, they are your heritage, you know. The way in which they would cook, perhaps, now you can accept that as your
intangible legacies.
Heritage. Is female infanticide your heritage? It's traditionally done. It's an age-old practice. It's tied in with a whole universe of meanings, you know. After all, there are reasons why female infanticide is to be done. Was it an inheritance,
or was it just the interjection of patriarchy?
No, Neelam, see, this is what I mean when I say that heritage is the uses that the present has for the past. So that which we like, that which we can use, we embrace as heritage. And that which we find repugnant or disturbing or uncomfortable, we are very quick to
put it in the dust.
Now, I'm not, of course, speaking for female infanticide and saying we must embrace it as our heritage, right? But I'm asking us to be quite clear about how constructed our notion of what constitutes our heritage is, and how something that belongs to this category today could belong to that category tomorrow, or have belonged to that category yesterday, right? So these slippages keep happening.
The slippages and leakages are constantly happening, but I think also nothing is written on stone.
Nothing is written on stone.
So these are always re-examined. Even text lends itself to interpretation. You talk about the 300 Ramayanas. It's just that we have the establishment version and we have the people's version. So it is basically like, as I was sharing with you yesterday, there's the SGPC version of Sikhism, which is not in terms of what I, coming from a family of theologists and priests,
would have imbibed,
understand and imbibe. So these are very complicated intellectual, emotional fields which have to be kind of negotiated, and they're informed by so many issues of time, of history, of social norms, practices, changes. So they lend themselves to such a complex, multiple vision of the universe, you know, to some extent.
But you know, so to take up what your illustration was of a Chola bronze, what right do I have it to have in my drawing room rather than in the museum? And I feel that, you know, you have a right to have it in the drawing room, the museum has a right to have it in its gallery, and the temple has a right to have it in its shrine, right?
Well, you have a very liberal view on this, and I think that's a view which should be the more acceptable view, that if it is common inheritance, then we all can dip into this vast pool of experience, and why shouldn't I claim it? If I am part of the collective, then why can't I drink into it?
Drink
so
of
I
it
fully comprehend that. Thank you very much, Kavita. I was quite nervous and unsure,
Arre?
but I think we just managed.
Thank you, Neelam. You're just wonderful as you.